Well, good morning or afternoon from wherever you are joining us. We might have a few people join us in a few minutes as we begin, but I wanted to keep us on schedule and keep us kind of going. Um, I am currently not in Winnipeg, not no longer. I am in Winnipeg full time, but right now in this moment, I am in California, um, beautiful sunny California, and just enjoying some times with some friends and some co-learners here. But that means that I am a guest on this land here. And so I acknowledge that I am a guest on the territory of the Huchun, the ancestral and unceded land of the Ohlone people and the successors of the historic and sovereign Verona Band of this county. And this land was and continues to be great importance to the Maui Mo Ohlone tribe and other familiar descendants of the Verona Band.
Hmm.
And so I am thankful for where you are joining us today. And so I know that we have people representing all parts of the land that we now know as Canada. I am thankful for Lenore, who is joining us. She'll share a little bit about herself, but we were co-learners together in our MTS program. And just so thankful that she is willing to come today and share some perspectives on the doctrine of discovery and how that really engages with us in the church. And so, as we begin, maybe Lenore, you can share a little bit about yourself, and then we can break out into breakout rooms just to say hello to each other.
Sure. I will introduce myself more fully in a little bit, but just to give you a little background, I retired from a 30-year career in civil rights for the federal government in Seattle. And then after that, I moved across Washington State so I could be a hands-on Unchi. Unchi is grandmother in Lakota. So I had two grandchildren here in Spokane, Washington. So that has been my major role, most important role for the last 10 years. But this is the first year that they don't need me in the morning or after school. They're in middle school now and they are on their own. So so I have time to do other things, and I'm really glad to be with you here today.
Thank you so much. So we're just going to go into quick breakout rooms just to introduce where you're from, maybe how you're connected to the Salvation Army, and then if you know anything about the doctrine of discovery, or if you know nothing, maybe do like a little scale. So 1 is you know very little, and 10 is you know a lot, and just share with each other where you're coming in from today and what perspectives you're
And
coming
I'm
from.
not a 10.
Welcome back, everybody. Um, so during this time, I'm just going to pass it over to Lenore and invite you to listen to Lenore's teachings.
Well, good morning. Was anybody a 10 in your group? No? Okay, then I'm safe. Mitako yapi, hihaniwashite, lila tayawa chianke. Good morning, my relatives. It's really good to see you here, even if it's on Zoom. And thank you, Crystal, for inviting me to do this. It's nice to spend time with new friends. So I bring you greetings from the ancestral lands of the Spokane people, the children of the sun. Since I'm a guest living in their homelands, I take a minute to honor their ancient relationship with the beautiful lands here. And like most tribes, the Spokane would say they are created here, and so they've always been here. Um, their oral traditions tell of the last ice age, and scientific evidence will place their ancestors back 15,000 years in this area. So by comparison, the settlers just arrived a short time ago without the same relationship to the land and water. And I take time for this little protocol because the Spokane people are still here. You know, history and time and Disney would erase them, but the land remembers. The land is a witness to that ancient relationship. And land acknowledgement is essential for relationship, and it also rejects the dehumanizing theology of the doctrine of discovery. Now to introduce myself, my name is Lenore 3 Stars, and I am Oglala Lakota, one of the 7 bands of the Lakota people, which make up the Teton division of the Oceti Sakowin. And the Oceti Sakowin is the 7 council fires, also known as the Great Sioux Nation. My father was Oglala Lakota, born on the Pine Ridge Reservation, where I was born, and my mother is from another one of the Lakota bands, Minikoju Lakota from Cheyenne River Reservation, also in South Dakota. Our ancestral lands include Hesapa, which is the Black Hills of South Dakota, where our creation story lives. I introduce myself in terms of kinship because in Lakota culture, the Tioshpaye, the family system, is foundational. It tells you what your responsibilities and roles in society are. So I know that when Native people are asking me, where are you from? What they're really asking me is, who are your people? And then from that, they can discern what my relationship to the land is, which for me would be Hesapa. Land relationship is an important part of Native identity. Crystal invited me to introduce the doctrine of discovery. So you know that I'm speaking from an American context, but I imagine that much of this will translate across to your own context. The doctrine of discovery and its effects are better understood, I think, in the context of an indigenous worldview and a theology of the land. The earth is the Lord's and all that is in it. That's an ancient Semitic worldview that all creation is sacred. Many indigenous worldviews hold that creation is our relative and that we are to live with the land, not on it. We are part of creation, not above it or apart from creation. Lakota call this way of thinking mitakuyasi, which means we are all related. We're related to each other, we're related to Creator, and we're related to all parts of creation, including the non-human parts. We call in Lakota the earth Inamaka, Mother Earth, or Unchimaka, Grandmother Earth. Those are terms of deep kinship and respect. Indigenous peoples generally have an interdependent worldview and a relational theology of the land. This picture of Matropaha is part of the Black Hills, and it's a sacred site in our ancestral lands. Our creation story says that our ancient ones emerged into the world from Hesapa. We know that land is a biblical theme, as in the Hebrew land covenant with Creator God. In the Hebrew creation story, Adam was created from Adama, the earth in Hebrew, and that seems to tell us that he was the land, or we are the land. That relationship is that deep. You are dust, and to dust you shall return. Indigenous peoples are connected with their lands in a reciprocal relationship, which means that the land has provided for you and you take care of the land in return. Each creation story places the peoples in a particular geographical location. That's the spiritual connection to place, and it's not transferable. It's not portable across the ocean. This sense of place is foundational to Native identity and culture. Scott M. Momaday, who is an author in Kiowa, he said, "You cannot separate the Native American from the landscape. It is his spirit." So this understanding lays how belonging to the land and being rooted to the land, how it explains how devastating Andrew Jackson's federal policies were of separating the Native peoples from their homelands. It was more than the cruelty of the many death marches out of their homelands. It was being torn out by the roots from your spiritual connection to place. the ethnic cleansing of the land was to make way for the incoming settlers, which is the legacy of the doctrine of discovery. I first learned about the legacy of the doctrine of discovery when I was doing research for a presentation that I made to a high school history class. I was asked to talk about 20th century Native issues, and I wasn't a speaker and I wasn't a teacher. So I had to do a lot of research, and I learned way more than I wanted to know. I understood why I felt more comfortable being Christian, being a Native Christian around white people, and then being a Christian around Native people. No Native wants to be associated with that kind of horrendous historical trauma that Euro-Western Christianity unleashed on Native peoples in this country, all in the name of Jesus. The Indian boarding schools were key to forcing assimilation on Native children. And those schools were not really schools, they were labor camps, and they were patterned after Civil War prisoner camps. I learned that I had ancestors on both sides of my family that went to Carlisle in Pennsylvania. And Carlisle was the first boarding school. It was a military boarding school for Native children established in 1879 by Lieutenant Richard Pratt, or lieutenant at that time. Following the Civil War, Native children were often forcibly taken and sent to these schools. That was around the time, right after the Lakota and our allies defeated General Custer at Little Bighorn in 1879. This picture of tiny tot handcuffs are actual handcuffs that were used for children to take them to school. So the campaign to kill Native inhabitants was not fully successful. So the federal policy became assimilation by force, kill the Indian to save the man. Schools were located throughout the United States in 29 US states, and they were intentionally remote because Native children were retaining some of their Native culture when they could occasionally connect with their families. Native identity in these schools was attacked by eliminating all cultural dress and inflicting harsh punishment when children spoke their native language or practiced any of their customs. Many children who survived these schools were left with anger and shame for their own culture, and they were unable to connect in their familiar and traditional ways when they were able to go back home. Many lost their native languages, which is a deep part of Native identity and value. My mom said that she learned comprehension by listening, but if the elders saw her in the room, they would quit talking. So she didn't learn to speak fluently, and she couldn't pass that down to me. So that's a personal legacy that the Doctrine of Discovery did for me, is that I had to learn the hard way. Boarding schools devastated the traditional pattern of rearing children by the extended family. You know, aunties and uncles and grandparents all had a role in raising children. You all taught the children customs and tribal knowledge and values at certain times. But that was lost in the boarding school. So with no good model for future parenting, this unresolved pain and grief was passed on to the next generation, and then the next generation. Hurt people hurt people. And when I was reading about this, a light just flipped on for me. I thought, well, no wonder I don't know any Native families who haven't been affected by this kind of dysfunction, by alcohol and addiction and abuse. I was talking to my friends, and they agreed that this kind of dysfunction seems to be a norm, that we are not shocked when we hear about bad things. And that's part of the legacy of the doctrine of discovery. One thing became apparent to me is that we were never meant to survive. As Dr. Andrea Smith taught in seminary, our role as natives in the narrative of white supremacy is to always be disappearing. After genocide, assimilation, confinement, relocation, reorganization, and termination comes blood quantum requirements and other congressional acts of colonization so that we can continually be disappearing. We are the visual reminders of this country's land theft and genocide, and nobody likes those reminders. So as I processed my research, I was left with that question: where did this level of dehumanizing treatment of natives, even children, where did that come from? How could Christians treat native children, even toddlers, in such a cold-blooded manner? Didn't Christianity teach Imago Dei, that we are all created in the image of God? There was no good news in boarding schools. I couldn't help crying, Jesus, where were you? It was while searching for insight into this question that I learned about the doctrine of discovery and its role in dehumanization. American public school doesn't accurately teach the historical injustice of genocide and the federal policies against Native peoples. Yet it does teach about manifest destiny, ascribing the conquest of Native peoples to God's will. I'd like to note a fallacy in the doctrine of discovery, thinking that Turtle Island, North America, was discovered as if nobody lived here before the European explorers arrived. That concept is called terra nullius, and it means the land is empty. Now, this map, you're not going to be able to read everything, but the map is meant to show you the multitudinous native nations that lived here for millennia, for thousands and thousands of years. So Turtle Island was not empty. You can't see the names of all the nations on the map, but it is to show us that pre-contact population estimations at the time of, say, Columbus, 1492, was up to 112 million indigenous peoples who lived here. By 1650, 150 years later, that population was cut down to 6 million. And historians have called this the greatest demographic disaster in the world. 106 million people gone in 150 years. So what is the doctrine of Christian discovery? It was a legal and religious concept set forth by a series of written papal bulls of edicts from the Pope. And the first one was given in 1452 by Pope Nicholas V. And it authorized King Alfonso of Portugal to capture, vanquish, and subdue the Saracens, which were the Muslims of the time, pagans, and other enemies of Christ, to put them into perpetual slavery and take all their possessions and property. It was basically an evil ideology that got to decide who gets to be human. As non-Christians, indigenous peoples were enemies of Christ and officially dehumanized. They had no human rights. Under this Christian discovery principle, and now many people do call it a Christian discovery principle because if you weren't Christian, that was the deciding factor. Under this principle, Columbus was given dominion over new lands with papal authority to subjugate, enslave, and murder indigenous inhabitants, which he did in the most brutal and depraved ways. He documented those in horrific detail, as did the clerics who accompanied him on the trips. He commented that the indigenous peoples were so friendly and giving that he could conquer them all with just 50 men. And that's one way of looking at that ingrained indigenous hospitality. Although Columbus didn't actually make it to America. He didn't actually discover America. He only made it to the Bahamas. But American schools, I think, are still recovering from that myth. And they celebrated that discovery and with a federal holiday that honored Columbus. Well, I think that's slowly changing into Indigenous Peoples Days. But it does speak to an American attitude of exceptionalism and an inability to recognize its history of genocide. This papal bull is from Pope Alexander VI, and it was made at the request of Ferdinand and Isabella to retroactively cover Columbus's 1492 trip to the Bahamas, where he decimated the Taino people. The U.S. has followed the same pattern of genocide and conquest with the misappropriation of divine will, considering themselves the chosen people and calling it manifest destiny. So propagating the Christian empire was all about the land and not about souls. The doctrine of discovery principle was instilled in the U.S. government when it was cited in the U.S. Supreme Court in SCOTUS rulings. This landmark case, Johnson versus McIntosh of 1823, cited the doctrine of discovery and reasoned that in 1776, the United States became a successor nation to the right of discovery and dominion from Great Britain, meaning that the U.S. Decided that it inherited that power of the doctrine of discovery from Britain when it formed its independence. So this case established the discovery principle into U.S. law, where it still is. In Johnson versus McIntosh, natives here lost their rights to complete sovereignty and only had the right of occupancy in their own ancestral lands. And they had no right to property title. This ruling still stands as the cornerstone of federal Indian policy and property law today. On reservations, the government owns the land for us, meaning that they hold the legal title for us, and they call that a trust relationship. Walter Echohawk, a prominent native rights lawyer and author, devoted a chapter in his book called In the Courts of the Conquerors, the 10 Worst Indian Law Cases Ever Decided. He devotes a whole chapter to Johnson versus McIntosh and explains why the case was tainted by bad ethics, racism, and colonialism, and personal financial interests by the court itself, and that it wouldn't stand in court today. Echohawk holds out hope that the legal work supporting the rights described in the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples has a chance of overturning Johnson versus McIntosh, because this declaration was written to respect and promote inherent rights of Indigenous peoples, especially the rights to their lands and their territories and their resources. Of course, we know the declaration is not legally binding, but it's a move towards resetting a norm for Indigenous rights. In 1831, the U.S. and the Cherokee Nation consummated several treaties during the 1800s as between sovereign nations. And they allotted lands in the state of Georgia to the Cherokee. In 1827, the Cherokee declared itself an independent nation and adopted a constitution. I mean, the United States liked civilized nations, right? So they did that, but Georgia decided that it did not want an independent nation within its own borders. So they passed Indian laws that proclaimed that all Cherokee laws, usages, and customs were invalid, and it gave Georgia the right to seize Cherokee lands. President Jackson refused to intervene in this, so the Cherokee Nation pressed their case to SCOTUS, and they lost when Justice Marshall cited the principle of discovery and found that the Cherokee tribe was a domestic dependent nation and that it was now subject to legislative authority. There are continuing examples of how the doctrine of discovery continued to oppress natives in the United States. And one would be the 1830 Indian Removal Act. As SCOTUS extinguished the right to land title, Indians were forcibly then deported from their lands by legislative authority, including the Trail of Tears and the Long Walk of the Navajo. From east of the Mississippi, Jackson drove the tribes west to open up land for incoming settlers. The 1887 Dawes Act, the General Allotment Act, divided up their homelands into 160-acre parcels for each family, which was a private property concept foreign to Native communal values, and it made it easy to swindle Indians out of that land. The remaining land was declared surplus and sold to settlers. Somehow, in that time, the name of my grandpa Louis Wakianzi, Yellow Thunder, was changed to Gassman. And it was a common practice for dishonest land agents to change Native names into European names in order to receive land dishonestly. In 1874, Hesapa, the Black Hills, were reserved to the Sioux Nation, or the Oceti-Sakowin, as a provision of this 1868 treaty. But when gold was discovered in the Black Hills by Custer's troops, then the U.S. broke the treaty, took the land back, and provided protection for the incoming miners. In 1980, SCOTUS found that the U.S. Had dealt dishonorably in that instance, and they said that they wrote that a more ripe and rank case of dishonorable dealings will never, in all probability, be found in our history. And they concluded that the U.S. took the Black Hills without just compensation, and they awarded $17 million to the Oceti-Sakowin, assuming that money would be justice, money would repair that. But in spite of reservation poverty, the Oceti-Sakowin has continually and to this day refused to accept that compensation because Hesapa was never for sale. One cannot own or sell grandmother Earth. Currently, the award sits at about 1.3 or $4 billion with interest, and it's still refused for reasons that can't be understood by a Western worldview. So as recently as 2005, we still see that the harm of the doctrine of discovery comes into play. In this case, SCOTUS cited the doctrine of discovery in a taxation decision against the Oneida Indian Nation when they attempted to assert immunity from local property taxes on parcels of land that they bought within their own historical reservation boundaries. In her opinion, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, she cited the doctrine of discovery, and she wrote that the tribe is precluded from rekindling embers of sovereignty that long ago grew cold, and that it was too late to set it right. And at one of our workshops, somebody blurts out, "Too late to set it right." That's not what the gospel says. So the legacy of the doctrine of discovery is historical violence of colonization. Trauma didn't end when the massacres were over because we carry a blood memory, referred to as epigenetics. Scientific evidence shows that the inherited DNA conveys transgenerational trauma response, HTR, which is a corporate PTSD. And this is also seen in descendants of African slaves, Holocaust victims and Japanese internees. It's accumulated, unresolved grief, and it can present colonial health deficits such as heart disease, alcoholism, diabetes, and suicidal ideation. The legacy of the doctrine of discovery hasn't stopped yet. As Sarah Augustine wrote in her book, The Land is Not Empty. Globally, right now, Indigenous peoples are still being murdered and evicted from their lands so that resources can be mined. And these are all legal actions taken based on laws that cite the doctrine of discovery. On Turtle Island, natives advocate on behalf of lost and stolen women, missing and murdered Indigenous women, and they put their lives on the line to protect the land and the water, their relatives. You add a pandemic to all of this, and you don't just get over it, but you can heal. Our blood memory also carries Creator's gift for healing. So I'd like to close with the story of grandmas. A couple of years ago, my mom and I visited my Takoja, my granddaughter's school, for Grandparents' Day, me and my mom. And her assignment included introducing her family to the teacher. And the teacher, she exclaimed, "Oh, you even brought your great grandma." And as I watched Mom and Shasha walking around the classroom, it seemed so cheery and normal. And then I suddenly thought of my great grandmother, my Unchi, which was not too many generations apart. And I thought how horrible her reality was. My great Unchi was the object of federally sanctioned genocide. She was a mini Koju Lakota woman named Wia Dokewia, Jenny in the lead. And she was my mom's grandmother. She managed to survive the massacre at Wounded Knee in South Dakota during the winter of 1890. The U.S. cavalry that had recently been decoded by the Lakota at Little Bighorn, they turned their Hotchkiss guns on the encampment and they killed about 250 relatives. Unchi survived riding away on a very fast horse, but the baby on her back did not survive. Many Native cultures say, make your decisions to consider the next 7 generations. And I look at my Takojas today and I see that Grandma Jenny did that. She survived, and then I don't know how, as a very young mother, she buried her baby, she made it back, and she just had to dig deep and find that strong heart. Woa Chinkanka, we call that perseverance. And she raised another generation of Lakota. So that's Unchi Jenny holding my mom's dad, my grandfather. If she hadn't done that, then there would not be my mother, would not be me, would not be my son. So since then, many, many more 7th generation decisions have been made, and many will continue to be made as we carry on. Creator Spirit helps us carry on because it is everywhere present, working out a redemptive purpose for all the relatives in all creation.
Well, Alan, thank you, Lenore.
Sure.
Such good wisdom and so many things that I just see, like, even applied to the Canadian context of how this has been seen within Canadian society. And you just replace whether it's you transition the words from America to Canada, or you look at how discoveries have taken place in Canada. I think it's that same mentality of invisibility and how do we, it's just such good wisdom for us. So I'm going to invite us to break out into breakout rooms at this point and discuss some of the new learnings that you received here today. Thoughts about how it influences the way that we sit in community together and do church together. And then maybe create a couple questions and we can come back and have a question and response time together. So I'm going to set the breakout room at about 8 minutes, and that way we'll have a similar time frame to be able to come back and ask questions before we get to the top of the hour. So they will be a little bit different of breakout rooms, so you won't be with the same people that you were before, but we will, we will create what we have there. Perfect. So they should be all open. Hello again. So we're just going to open it up for some questions. We have about 6 minutes left. So we want to honor the 1 hour time frame. But yeah, so anybody from the groups, we just open it up and you can ask questions to Lenore and she'll give you a good response.
I'll ask Lenore, and I'm not sure that you can answer the question, but I'm going to ask anyways. When we look at the doctrine of discovery in the North American context of the discovering of new lands, the conquering of new lands, if we use that language, well, one of the questions that we got talking about in the group that I was in is there similar conversations going on in other continents? So I use the example in the other group, in the European context, where crusaders came through and conquered lands, discovered new lands and conquered lands. Do you know if some of that same language is happening in the conquering of other societies and other lands around the world?
Right. Yeah. In Sarah Augustine's book, The Land is Not Empty, she's talking about what is happening even right now. I mean, we hear about Indigenous peoples who are trying to protect the land and resources, the butterfly defenders in Mexico being murdered, the forest defenders in Ecuador who are being murdered, the people in the Amazon who are being murdered so that the extraction can take place there, and how that is based on based on laws that are based on the doctrine of discovery. And so there, some of the countries like Ecuador, they're responding by giving the rights, human rights, natural rights to like the rivers. They have the same right as a human being to live and to flourish. So the land is receiving some rights, even constitutionally. They're adopting that kind of language in the Constitution. And in America, you know, who gets those rights is corporations. They are regarded as human. They have to have human rights in America. So you can see that it's a world battle of world views. But yeah, these conversations are happening all over because Indigenous people are regaining their cultures and speaking.
Lenore, I have a highly unfair question to ask you.
Oh, good.
So I originally learned about the doctrine of discovery during their most recent papal visit to Canada. And there was a very strong call for a repeal of the doctrine of discovery. What do you think is the church's hesitancy to do that?
Well, there's complicity. I mean, it's just like in America, we have this attitude of exceptionalism. We can't admit that there was land theft and genocide. And I think the church has complicit in how Indigenous people's land was taken, how they were colonized. The church benefited from land grants. The church benefited in a lot of different ways and still are because they're on that same land. Although I hear cases where they're returning land, which is really encouraging. But yeah, I think the church also then would have a role to take lead in healing, in providing space for these conversations to take place, in finding out who the Indigenous people are in the lands where they are, learning what the justice issues are that the Indigenous people are facing, and then trying to follow the lead of the Native leaders as they work on those justice issues together. In my area, it's uranium poisoning in the salmon cultures. And so when the Indigenous people ask the public, you know, would you please make a public comment so that we can retain these EPA standards and get the land cleaned up from this uranium poisoning? when they ask you to do that, then I think we can come alongside, and the church should be front and center saying, yeah, we will support that.
We are at the top of the hour, but if there is another question, I will honor it if there is, but I don't think there is. So we're good.
Well, thank you so much for giving me your time.
Thank you so much, Lenore. We really appreciate it. And just a reminder, there will be more webinars coming up from the Core Mission Resource Department. Next week, we will be doing one as well on land acknowledgements, and invite you to come along. It's the same time. Hopefully, this is kind of the time frame that I'm wanting for the webinars coming out of my office. Would be on the Thursdays at this same time frame. So it might be varying on the day, which Thursday it is in the month, but we're hoping for this time frame and this, this day. So I thank you very much. You are getting lots of good comments, Lenore, in the comment section. So I hope you have time to read those. But thank you, Will Allen, for everybody who came today.